Zora Jackson had always prided herself on her intuition. It was what made her an exceptional realtor. The ability to read people, to understand their desires and fears, and to match them with their perfect home. But on that fateful day in early spring, she realized that her vaunted intuition had failed her in the most personal way possible. The day had started like any other. Zora had risen early, as was her habit, to prepare for a busy day of showings and client meetings. She had left Isaiah sleeping, his tall frame sprawled across their king-sized bed, his face peaceful in repose. As she'd gazed at him, a wave of affection had washed over her, tinged with a hint of pride. They had been together for 15 years, married for 10, and she still marveled at how handsome he was, how brilliant, how kind. But that feeling of contentment had been short-lived. As she'd reached for her phone to check her schedule, she'd noticed a text message notification from an unfamiliar number. Curious, she'd opened it, and in that instant, her world had come crashing down around her. The message was simple, just a few words, but they were enough to shatter the illusion of her perfect life. "Your husband is sleeping with your sister." Zora had stared at the screen, her mind refusing to process the words. It had to be a mistake, a cruel joke, or a case of mistaken identity. Isaiah would never betray her like that. And Naya? Her baby sister? The very thought was absurd. But as the initial shock wore off, doubt began to creep in. Small inconsistencies in Isaiah's behavior over the past few months suddenly took on new significance. The late nights at the lab, the hushed phone conversations, the sudden interest in his appearance, all things she had attributed to his growing success in his field, now seemed sinister in light of this new information. And Naya? Zora's relationship with her younger sister had always been complicated. 5 years her junior, Nia had always seemed to be chasing after what Zora had. The same career path, the same social circles, even the same men. But surely she wouldn't go this far? As she typed out a reply to the anonymous messenger, "Who is this? How do you know this?" The response came almost immediately. "A friend who thinks you deserve to know the truth. Check Isaiah's phone if you don't believe me." Zora's gaze darted to the stairs leading up to their bedroom. Isaiah's phone was always with him, even when he slept. But she had to know. The need for certainty overwhelmed her usual respect for privacy. With her heart pounding, she crept up the stairs, each step feeling like a betrayal in itself. She paused at the bedroom door, listening to Isaiah's steady breathing. Then, moving with the stealth of a cat, she approached his nightstand. His phone lay there, innocuous and unassuming. Zora hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the home button. Did she really want to know? Could she handle the truth if the anonymous texter was right? Taking a deep breath, she pressed her thumb to the fingerprint sensor. The screen unlocked. They had shared their passcodes years ago, a gesture of trust that now felt like a cruel joke. With trembling fingers, she opened his messages. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Work-related texts, messages from friends, a group chat with his lab colleagues. But then she saw it, a conversation with a contact simply labeled N. Zora's heart sank as she opened the thread. The messages left no room for doubt. Intimate exchanges, declarations of love, plans for secret meetings, all between her husband and her sister. She felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. The room spun, and she had to grip the nightstand to keep from falling. A small gasp escaped her lips, causing Isaiah to stir. "Zora? Zora?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "What are you doing?" She turned to face him, his phone still clutched in her hand. The look of confusion on his face quickly morphed into one of horror as he realized what she had discovered. "How could you?" Zora whispered, her voice barely audible. "With my own sister?" Isaiah sat up, reaching out to her. "Zora, I can explain." But she was already backing away, shaking her head. "Don't touch me," she hissed. Don't you dare touch me. With that, she fled the room, leaving Isaiah calling after her. She ran down the stairs, grabbed her keys, a fuse, and was out the door before he could even get out of bed. As she peeled out of the driveway, her vision blurred by tears, Zora had no idea where she was going. All she knew was that she needed to get away, to process the devastating betrayal that had just upended her entire world. Bookmark NF52FDU. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. The events set in motion by this discovery would lead to a spiral of passion and ultimately a crime that would shock the entire community. Bookmark. The sleek black Lexus sped through the streets of Atlanta, its driver oblivious to the beauty of the city awakening around her. Zora's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, her mind a whirlwind of emotions: anger, hurt, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss. She found herself pulling into the parking lot of Piedmont Park, a place that had always brought her solace. As she stepped out of the car, the early morning joggers and dog walkers paid her no mind, unaware of the turmoil raging within her. Zora made her way to a secluded bench overlooking the lake, her legs moving on autopilot. As she sat down, the full weight of what she had discovered came crashing down on her. The sobs she had been holding back erupted, her body shaking with the force of her grief. How could Isaiah do this to her? They had built a life together, supported each other's dreams, weathered the storms that came with building successful careers. And Naya, her own flesh and blood. The betrayal cut deep, leaving a wound Zora wasn't sure would ever heal. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Zora's tears gradually subsided, replaced by a cold, hard anger. She pulled out her phone, ignoring the dozens of missed calls and messages from Isaiah. Instead, she dialed a number she knew by heart. Hello? Hello? Nia's voice was groggy with sleep. How long? Zora's voice was ice. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Zora, what are you talking about? Don't play dumb with me, Nia. How long have you been sleeping with my husband? The silence that followed was all the confirmation Zora needed. Zora, I'm so sorry. It just happened. We never meant to. Save it. Zora cut her off. I don't want to hear your excuses. You're dead to me, both of you. She ended the call and turned off her phone, unable to bear the thought of any more communication with either of them. As she sat there, staring out at the calm waters of the lake, a plan began to form in Zora's mind. The hurt and betrayal she felt were slowly being replaced by a burning desire for revenge. They had destroyed her life, her trust, her family. Now, she would destroy them. But first, she needed to gather herself. She was Zora Jackson, Atlanta's top realtor, known for her poise and professionalism. She couldn't let this break her, at least not publicly. With a deep breath, she stood up, smoothed down her clothes, and made her way back to her car. As she drove home, Zora's mind raced with possibilities. She knew she couldn't continue living with Isaiah, but she also knew that leaving would be seen as a sign of weakness. No, she needed to play this smart. She would stay for now and let them think they had gotten away with it. All the while, she would be plotting her revenge. When she pulled into her driveway, she saw Isaiah's car was gone. Good. She didn't think she could face him right now without doing something she might regret. As she entered the house, the silence was deafening. She made her way to their bedroom. No, her bedroom now, and began methodically removing Isaiah's things, packing them into suitcases and boxes. Bookmark and FF. By the time she was done, it was as if he had never lived there. She left the packed belongings in the guest room, a clear message for when he returned. Then she showered, dressed in one of her sharpest business suits, and headed to the office. She had clients to meet, houses to sell. Life, as they say, must go on. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm was brewing. Zora was formulating a plan, one that would make Isaiah and Naya, pay for their betrayal. Little did she know, her actions in the coming weeks would set off a chain of events that would end in tragedy. As she drove to her first appointment of the day, Zora's mind drifted to Isaiah's brother, Elijah. A small smile played on her lips as she remembered their easy camaraderie, the way he'd always made her laugh. Perhaps it was time to give Elijah a call to seek comfort in the arms of family. After all, what better way to hurt Isaiah than to give him a taste of his own medicine? The seed of an idea had been planted, one that would grow into something far more dangerous than Zora could have ever imagined. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Zora. On the surface, she maintained her composure, throwing herself into her work with a fervor that impressed even her most demanding clients. Her colleagues marveled at her resilience, unaware of the turmoil that seethed beneath her polished exterior. At home, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Isaiah had returned, chastened and apologetic, but Zora had relegated him to the guest room. Their interactions were cold and formal, limited to the bare minimum required to maintain the facade of normalcy for the outside world. Bookmark 52. Nia had tried reaching out multiple times, leaving tearful voicemails and sending pleading text messages. Zora ignored them all, her sister's betrayal a constant throbbing ache in her chest. Bookmark. But while Zora appeared to be coping admirably to those around her, inside she was plotting. The seed of an idea that had taken root that day in the park had grown into a full-fledged plan, one that would satisfy her thirst for revenge and inflict the same pain on Isaiah that he had caused her. Bookmark. It was on a balmy Friday evening 3 weeks after her world had imploded that Zora put her plan into motion. She had just closed a major deal, selling a multi-million-dollar property in Buckhead. The commission alone would have been cause for celebration in the past. Now it merely provided her with the perfect excuse. "We should celebrate," she said to Isaiah over dinner, her tone casual, as if the past weeks of icy silence had never happened. "Why don't you invite Elijah over tomorrow night? I'll cook, we'll open some wine. It'll be nice to have family around." Isaiah looked up, surprise and hope warring in his eyes. "Are you sure? I mean, yes, of course. I'd like that. I'm sure Elijah would too." Zora nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Good. It's settled then." As Isaiah busied himself with texting his brother, Zora allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Phase 1 of her plan was in motion. The next evening, Zora found herself in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on a lavish meal. She had chosen to wear a dress that she knew accentuated her curves, its deep red color a stark contrast against her dark skin. Her hair fell in soft waves around her face, and she had applied her makeup with particular care. The doorbell rang, and she heard Isaiah greeting his brother. Taking a deep breath, Zora stepped out of the kitchen to welcome their guest. Elijah Jackson was the spitting image of his brother, with the same tall, athletic build and warm brown eyes. But where Isaiah's features were sharp and angular, Elijah's were softer, more approachable. His easy smile lit up the room as he caught sight of Zora. "There's my favorite sister-in-law," he exclaimed, enveloping her in a warm hug. "You look amazing, as always." Zora allowed herself to relax into his embrace for a moment longer than necessary. "It's good to see you, Elijah," she murmured, pulling back to meet his gaze. "I'm so glad you could make it." The evening progressed smoothly, the conversation flowing as freely as the wine. Zora made sure to keep Isaiah's glass topped up, encouraging him to relax and enjoy himself. As the night wore on, she could see his eyelids growing heavy, his words becoming slightly slurred. "I think I need to lie down for a bit," Isaiah mumbled, struggling to his feet. "You two carry on without me." As he stumbled up the stairs, Zora turned to Elijah, her eyes glinting in the low light. "More wine?" she offered, already reaching for the bottle. Elijah nodded, his gaze lingering on her as she poured. "You know," he said softly, "I've always admired you, Zora. The way you handle yourself, your drive, your passion. Isaiah's a lucky man. Zora's laugh was low and bitter. Is he now? She murmured, moving closer to Elijah on the couch. And what if I told you that Isaiah doesn't appreciate what he has? Bookmark. Elijah's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? Instead of answering, Zora leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear. What if I told you that I've always wondered what it would be like to be with you instead? She felt Elijah stiffen, then slowly relax. Zora, he breathed, his voice husky with desire and uncertainty. We shouldn't. But Zora was already closing the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a searing kiss. For a moment, Elijah resisted. Then with a groan, he pulled her closer, returning the kiss with equal fervor. As things heated up between them, a small part of Zora's mind registered the sound of a door opening upstairs. Perfect timing, she thought, as she allowed Elijah to lower her onto the couch. The gasp from the stairway was exactly what Zora had been waiting for. She broke away from Elijah, looking up to see Isaiah standing there, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. What the hell is going on here? Isaiah's voice was strangled, his eyes darting between his wife and his brother. Elijah jumped up, his face flushed with guilt and alcohol. Isaiah, it's not what it looks like. But Zora remained where she was, her gaze locked on Isaiah. Isn't it? She said coolly. How does it feel, Isaiah, to see the person you love in the arms of someone else, someone you trust? Understanding dawned on Isaiah's face, quickly followed by anger. Is this some kind of sick revenge, Zora? Using my own brother? Zora stood, smoothing down her dress. You reap what you sow, my dear husband. You and Nia taught me that. Bookmark the room fell into a tense silence, the air thick with unspoken accusations and simmering rage. Little did any of them know, this was only the beginning. The events set in motion that night would spiral far beyond Zora's carefully laid plans, leading to consequences none of them could have foreseen. Bookmark. As Elijah stammered apologies and Isaiah's face contorted with a mix of guilt and fury, Zora felt a twinge of satisfaction. But beneath that, a flicker of fear. She had opened Pandora's box, and there was no telling what might emerge. The weeks following that fateful night were a maelstrom of emotions and confrontations. The fragile facade of normalcy that Zora had maintained crumbled, revealing the raw, festering wound of betrayal beneath. Isaiah, caught in guilt over his own indiscretion and rage at Zora's calculated revenge, became volatile and unpredictable. One moment he would be pleading for forgiveness, the next hurling accusations and threats. The once peaceful Jackson household became a battleground, with neither party willing to concede defeat. Elijah, racked with guilt over his role in the unfolding drama, tried to mediate between his brother and sister-in-law. But his efforts only served to further complicate the situation, as Isaiah's jealousy and suspicion grew with each interaction between Elijah and Zora. Bookmark. Nia, still desperate to make amends, continued her attempts to contact Zora. Her calls went unanswered, her messages unread, but her persistence would soon add fuel to the already raging fire. It was on a stormy Tuesday evening, about a month after the dinner party incident, that things came to a head. Zora had just returned from a long day of showings, her nerves frayed from the constant tension at home and the strain of maintaining her professional persona. As she walked through the door, she was met with the sight of Isaiah pacing the living room, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. The wild look in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. Well, look who's finally home, Isaiah slurred, his words thick with alcohol and barely suppressed rage. Have a good day selling houses and ruining lives? Zora sighed, setting down her briefcase. I'm not in the mood for this, Isaiah. We both made mistakes. Can't we just... Mistakes? Isaiah's laugh was harsh and humorless. Is that what you call fucking my brother? A mistake? That's rich coming from you? Zora shot back, her own anger rising to meet his. At least I didn't carry on a long-term affair with your sister. Isaiah's face contorted with fury. No, you just decided to destroy our entire family in one night. Do you have any idea what you've done? Elijah can barely look me in the eye. Our parents are devastated. And for what? Some petty revenge? Petty? Zora's voice rose, years of pent-up frustration and recent betrayal pouring out. You betrayed me with my own sister. You broke every vow we ever made. Her words were cut off as Isaiah's hand connected with her cheek, the force of the slap sending her stumbling backward. For a moment, they both froze, shocked by the sudden escalation to physical violence. Then, with a cry of rage, Zora launched herself at Isaiah. They grappled, years of love turned to hatred fueling their actions. In the chaos, Isaiah's whiskey glass shattered on the hardwood floor, shards of glass glinting dangerously in the low light. As they struggled, Zora's foot came down on a piece of broken glass. She cried out in pain, momentarily distracted. Isaiah, his judgment clouded by alcohol and anger, seized the opportunity. He grabbed Zora by the shoulders, shaking her violently. You've ruined everything, he shouted, his face inches from hers. Everything we built, everything we were supposed to be. Bookmark. Zora, fear and fury warring within her, reached out blindly. Her hand closed around a heavy crystal vase, a wedding gift from what now seemed like a lifetime ago. Without thinking, she swung it with all her might. The vase connected with the side of Isaiah's head with a sickening thud. His eyes widened in shock, then rolled back as he crumpled to the floor. Zora stood there, the vase slipping from her nerveless fingers to shatter beside Isaiah's prone form. Blood began to pool around his head, stark against the pale hardwood floor. Isaiah, she whispered, her voice trembling. Isaiah, get up. Please, get up. But Isaiah didn't move. As the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, Zora felt the world tilting on its axis. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't part of the plan. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone, ready to call for help. But as her finger hovered over the emergency call button, a new thought struck her. If she called now, her life as she knew it would be over. She would lose everything, her career, her reputation, her freedom. In that moment, standing over her husband's motionless body, Zora made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. She lowered the phone, her mind already racing with possibilities. She needed help, but not from the authorities. No, she needed someone who would understand, someone who was already implicated in this mess. With a deep breath, she dialed a number she had come to know by heart. Elijah, I need your help. Something terrible has happened. As she waited for Elijah to arrive, Zora sank to the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes never leaving Isaiah's still form. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows as if nature itself was recoiling from the tragedy unfolding within the Jackson home. Little did Zora know, this was only the beginning of a dark and twisted path. The choices she would make in the coming hours and days would test the limits of loyalty, morality, and the human capacity for self-preservation. The web of lies and betrayal she had woven was about to become infinitely more complex, with consequences that would ripple out far beyond the confines of their Atlanta suburb. Bookmark. NF feet. The pounding on the front door jolted Zora out of her shock-induced stupor. She scrambled to her feet, casting one last desperate glance at Isaiah's motionless form before hurrying to let Elijah in. As soon as she opened the door, Elijah burst in, his eyes wild with concern. Zora, what's going on? What happened? You sounded... His words died in his throat as he took in the scene before him. The overturned furniture, the shattered glass, and most horrifyingly, his brother lying in a pool of blood. Oh my God, he breathed, rushing to Isaiah's side. Is he? Bookmark. Zora's voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know. We were fighting and I didn't mean to. It just happened so fast. Elijah pressed his fingers to Isaiah's neck, searching for a pulse. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up at Zora, his face ashen. He's alive, but barely. We need to call an ambulance. As he reached for his phone, Zora's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. No, we can't. What do you mean we can't? Zora, he needs medical attention. If we call an ambulance, they'll involve the police. They'll ask questions. I'll lose everything, Elijah. My career, my freedom. Everything. Elijah stared at her, disbelief etched across his features. Are you seriously suggesting we don't get him help? Zora, this is Isaiah we're talking about. My brother. Your husband. The husband who betrayed me with my own sister. Zora spat, her voice suddenly hard. The man who just minutes ago hit me and might have done worse if I hadn't defended myself. She could see the conflict in Elijah's eyes, the war between his loyalty to his brother and his feelings for her. She pressed on, her voice softening. Please, Elijah, I need your help. We can figure this out together. For a long moment, Elijah was silent, his gaze moving between Isaiah's unconscious form and Zora's pleading eyes. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the decision. What do you want to do? Relief flooded through Zora. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she had been counting on Elijah's support. We need to clean this up, make it look like an accident. Over the next few hours, Zora and Elijah worked in tense silence, meticulously erasing all signs of the violent confrontation. They cleaned the blood, disposed of the broken glass and vase, and rearranged the furniture. By the time they were done, the living room looked pristine, as if nothing had ever happened there. Then came the hardest part. Together, they carried Isaiah's still unconscious body up the stairs to the master bathroom. With trembling hands, they arranged him in the bathtub, positioning him to make it look as though he had slipped and hit his head. As they stepped back to survey their handiwork, the magnitude of what they had done hit Zora like a physical blow. She turned to Elijah, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. What have we done? Bookmark. Elijah pulled her into his arms, his own body shaking. What we had to do, he murmured into her hair. We'll get through this, Zora. Together. They stayed like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other. Then, taking a deep breath, Zora stepped back. Okay, now we need to establish our alibi. She outlined her plan quickly. They would go out, be seen in public. Then they would return home, ostensibly to find Isaiah unconscious in the bathroom. It would look like a tragic accident, nothing more. As they prepared to leave, Zora cast one last glance at Isaiah. A flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Was this really the right thing to do? But then she remembered his betrayal, the feel of his hands striking her face, and her resolve hardened. There was no turning back now. Bookmark F2F. Little did Zora and Elijah know their actions that night would set in motion a chain of events that would test the limits of their newfound alliance. As they stepped out into the rain-soaked night, they were unknowingly stepping onto a path that would lead them into an ever-deepening spiral of lies, guilt, and unforeseen consequences. The stage was set for a drama that would shake the foundations of their lives and the lives of those around them. In the coming days and weeks, loyalties would be tested, secrets would be uncovered, and the true cost of their desperate measures would become painfully clear. As Zora locked the door behind them, leaving Isaiah alone and unconscious, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The Zora Jackson who had walked into that house earlier that evening was gone, replaced by a woman capable of deception, manipulation, and perhaps even worse. The rain continued to fall, washing away the physical evidence of their crime. But the emotional and psychological stains of that night would prove far harder to erase, lingering long after the storm had passed. As Zora and Nia settled into their seats in the bustling hospital cafeteria, an uncomfortable silence stretched between them. The sisters, once inseparable, now felt like strangers, separated by a chasm of betrayal and unspoken truths. Nia was the first to break the silence. Zora, I don't even know where to begin. I'm so sorry about Isaiah, and I'm sorry for everything else. What happened between us, it was a mistake. A terrible, unforgivable mistake. Zora stared into her coffee, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to lash out, to unleash all the pain and anger she'd been holding back, but she knew she couldn't afford to lose control. Not now, when everything was hanging by a thread. "Why are you really here, Nia?" Zora asked, her voice low and controlled. Nia leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "I'm here because you're my sister, and Isaiah was important to me too. When I heard about the accident, I couldn't stay away. Zora, please, can we try to move past this for Isaiah's sake, if nothing else?" Zora's laugh was bitter. "Move past it? You slept with my husband, Nia. You betrayed me in the worst possible way, and now you want to play the concerned sister-in-law?" "I know what I did was unforgivable," Nia whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "But Zora, something doesn't feel right about all this. The timing, the circumstances, it's just too convenient." Zora felt her heart rate spike. "What are you implying?" Nia hesitated, then pressed on. "I've been talking to some of Isaiah's colleagues. They said he was acting strange in the days leading up to the accident. He seemed scared, Zora, like he knew something bad was going to happen." For a moment, Zora's carefully constructed facade cracked. Fear, guilt, and anger warred within her. But years of professional poise came to her rescue. She leaned back, her face a mask of indignation. "So not only did you betray me, but now you're accusing me of what? Hurting my own husband? You've got some nerve, Nia." Nia backpedaled quickly. No, that's not what I meant. I'm just worried. About Isaiah, about you, about all of us. This whole situation is such a mess, and I can't help feeling responsible." As Nia continued to ramble, expressing her guilt and concern, Zora's mind was working overtime. Her sister's presence complicated things enormously. If Nia started asking questions, digging into the events leading up to Isaiah's accident, it could unravel everything. "Enough," Zora cut her off mid-sentence. "I appreciate your concern, Nia, but I think it's best if you leave. Isaiah needs peace and quiet to recover, and frankly, your presence here is only adding to my stress." Nia looked stricken. "But Zora, we're family. Surely we can." "Family?" Zora's voice was ice. "You lost the right to call us family when you decided to sleep with my husband. Now please, just go." As Nia reluctantly gathered her things and left, Zora felt a mix of relief and dread. She had managed to deflect her sister's suspicions for now, but she knew this wasn't the end. Nia's appearance had added a new layer of complexity to an already precarious situation. Zora pulled out her phone and quickly typed out a message to Elijah. "We need to talk. Now." As she waited for his reply, Zora couldn't shake the feeling that the carefully constructed lie she and Elijah had built was starting to crumble. Nia's words echoed in her mind. He seemed scared, like he knew something bad was going to happen. What if Isaiah had suspected something? What if he had confided in someone before the confrontation? The possibilities made Zora's head spin. She glanced at her watch. It was almost time for her to return to Isaiah's room for the doctor's rounds. As she stood to leave, Zora caught sight of her reflection in the cafeteria window. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, cool, collected, and capable of things she never thought possible. As she made her way back to the ICU, Zora steeled herself for what was to come. She had come too far to let everything fall apart now. Whatever challenges lay ahead, be it Nia's suspicions, Detective Carter's investigation, or her own gnawing guilt, she would face them head-on. Little did Zora know, the web of lies and deceit she had woven was about to become even more tangled. As she stepped into the elevator, her phone buzzed with a message from Elijah. "Can't talk now. Something's come up. We'll explain later." The doors closed, and Zora felt a chill run down her spine. What new complication was waiting for her now? As the elevator ascended, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was heading not just to the ICU, but towards a reckoning that would change everything. The following days brought a flurry of activity that left Zora feeling as if she were caught in the eye of a storm. Isaiah's condition remained critical but stable. The steady beat of his heart, a constant reminder of the precarious nature of their situation. Detective Carter had become a frequent presence, her probing questions growing increasingly pointed with each visit. Zora maintained her composure, but she could feel the detective's suspicion like a physical weight. It was during one such visit that things took an unexpected turn. Zora was sitting by Isaiah's bedside, pretending to read a magazine while actually watching Detective Carter out of the corner of her eye. The detective was speaking in hushed tones with one of the nurses, her brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly, Carter's head snapped up, her gaze locking with Zora's. There was something in her eyes, a glint of triumph perhaps, that made Zora's blood run cold. "Mrs. Jackson," Carter said, her voice deceptively casual, "I was wondering if you could clarify something for me. You mentioned that you and Mr. Elijah Jackson had dinner together on the night of your husband's accident. Could you remind me where you dined?" Zora's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "Of course, detective. We had dinner at Bacchanalia. It's one of our favorite restaurants." Carter nodded, making a note in her ever-present notebook. "Interesting. You see, we've been reviewing security footage from the area, and we can't seem to find any evidence of you or Mr. Elijah Jackson at Bacchanalia that night. In fact, we can't place either of you at any restaurant in the city during the time frame you mentioned." For a moment, Zora felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Carter pressed on, her voice hardening. "Mrs. Jackson, I'm going to need you and Mr. Elijah Jackson to come down to the station for further questioning, and I strongly advise you to consider hiring an attorney." As the detective left the room, Zora's mind raced. How had they slipped up so badly? They had been so careful, so meticulous in planning their alibi. And yet, with a few simple words, Detective Carter had shattered their carefully constructed facade. Zora's hands shook as she reached for her phone to call Elijah. But before she could dial, a text message flashed across the screen. It was from an unknown number. "I know what you did. Meet me at Piedmont Park at midnight if you want to keep your secret safe." Zora stared at the message, her mind reeling. Who could have sent this? Nia? One of Isaiah's colleagues? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone who had witnessed something they shouldn't have? As she contemplated her next move, a soft groan from the bed caught her attention. Zora's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Isaiah's eyelids were fluttering, his fingers twitching slightly. "Isaiah?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening as they settled on her face. For a long moment, they stared at each other in silence. Then Isaiah's lips parted, and he spoke, his voice barely audible. "I remember everything, Zora. Everything." In that instant, Zora felt her world tilt on its axis. The fragile house of cards she had built was collapsing around her, and she was powerless to stop it. As nurses rushed in, alerted by the change in Isaiah's vital signs, Zora backed away from the bed. Her mind was in chaos, torn between relief at Isaiah's recovery and terror at the implications of his words. She stumbled out of the room, ignoring the concerned calls of the medical staff. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, struggling to catch her breath. The events of the past week swirled in her mind. The confrontation with Isaiah, the desperate cover-up with Elijah, Nia's suspicions, Detective Carter's investigation, and now this mysterious text message. Zora closed her eyes, trying to center herself. When she opened them again, she was once again the poised, confident woman she presented to the world. But inside, she was screaming. As she made her way out of the hospital, Zora knew she was standing at a crossroads. The choices she made in the next few hours would determine not just her fate, but the fates of everyone involved in this tangled web of betrayal and deceit. The sun was setting as Zora stepped outside, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She checked her watch, still hours to go before the midnight meeting in Piedmont Park. Hours to decide whether to run, to confess, or to dive even deeper into the darkness that had consumed her life. As she got into her car, Zora's resolve hardened. She had come too far to give up now. Whatever challenges lay ahead, be it Isaiah's awakening, Detective Carter's investigation, or this mysterious blackmailer, she would face them head-on. The game had changed, but Zora was determined to be the one controlling the board. As she pulled out of the hospital parking lot, her mind was already formulating a new plan. The night ahead promised to be long and fraught with danger, but Zora Jackson was ready for whatever it might bring. Little did she know, the events about to unfold would test her in ways she could never have imagined, pushing her to the very limits of her cunning, her courage, and her capacity for survival. The clock on Zora's dashboard read 11:55 p.m. as she pulled into a parking spot near Piedmont Park. The night was unusually quiet, the typically bustling Atlanta streets eerily empty. As she stepped out of her car, the cool night air sent a shiver down her spine, or perhaps it was the weight of what she was about to do. Zora had spent the hours since leaving the hospital in a frenzy of activity. She had called Elijah, filling him in on the latest developments in hushed, urgent tones. They had argued, Elijah insisting that they come clean, Zora adamant that they could still salvage the situation. In the end, Elijah had reluctantly agreed to let Zora handle the midnight meeting alone, but his parting words echoed in her mind. "Be careful, Zora. We're in way over our heads." Now, as she made her way into the darkened park, Zora couldn't help but feel that Elijah might have been right. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist around her, every rustle of leaves making her jump. She clutched her purse tightly, acutely aware of its contents: a small recorder, a canister of pepper spray, and a burner phone she had purchased earlier that evening. As she approached the agreed-upon meeting spot near the lake, Zora's eyes strained to make out any sign of her mysterious blackmailer. The area was deserted, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the shore. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "I'm here. Show yourself." For a long moment, there was no response. Then, from the shadows of a nearby cluster of trees, a figure emerged. Zora's breath caught in her throat as the person stepped into the dim light of a nearby lamppost. "Nia," she gasped, disbelief coloring her voice. Her sister stood before her, looking nothing like the tearful, pleading woman from the hospital cafeteria. This Nia was composed, her eyes hard and calculating. "Surprised to see me, sis?" Nia's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out?" Zora's mind raced, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. "Figure what out?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Nia, what is this about?" Nia laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed across the water. "Oh, come on, Zora, drop the act. I know what you did to Isaiah, what you and Elijah did." For a moment, Zora considered continuing to deny everything, but looking into her sister's eyes, she knew it was pointless. Somehow, Nia had pieced it all together. "How?" Zora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You got sloppy," Nia replied, a hint of triumph in her tone. "The night it happened, I was driving by your house. I saw you and Elijah leaving, saw the state you were both in. It didn't take much to put two and two together, especially after talking to Isaiah's colleagues about how strange he'd been acting." Zora's mind whirled, trying to formulate a plan. "So what now? You're blackmailing me? Your own sister?" Nia's expression hardened. "You stopped being my sister the moment you tried to kill Isaiah. He might have betrayed you, Zora, but he didn't deserve that." "And what about your betrayal?" Zora shot back, anger rising to meet her fear. "You slept with my husband, Nia. You destroyed our family long before that night." For a moment, guilt flashed across Nia's face, but it was quickly replaced by resolve. "What's done is done. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to confess everything to the police. You'll leave Elijah out of it. He doesn't deserve to go down for your crimes." Zora stared at her sister in disbelief. "And why would I do that?" Nia pulled out her phone. "Because if you don't, this video of you and Elijah leaving the house that night goes straight to Detective Carter. Your choice, Zora. Confess, or I'll make sure you both go down for this." Time seemed to stand still as Zora weighed her options. She could feel the walls closing in, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. But as she looked at Nia, something inside her snapped. With a cry of rage, Zora lunged forward, catching Nia off guard. They grappled, Zora's hands clawing for the phone. In the struggle, they lost their footing on the damp grass, tumbling towards the lake's edge. There was a splash, a scream cut short. Then silence. Zora found herself in the shallow water, gasping for breath. A few feet away, Nia's body floated face down, motionless. For a moment, Zora could only stare in horror at what she had done. Then, survival instinct kicked in. She waded over to Nia, checking for any signs of life. Finding none, she made a decision that would seal her fate once and for all. With trembling hands, she dragged Nia's body further into the lake, pushing it out towards deeper water. As she watched her sister's form disappear into the darkness, Zora felt a piece of her soul go with it. Soaked and shivering, Zora made her way back to shore. She retrieved Nia's phone, which had fallen during their struggle, and slipped it into her purse. As she hurried back towards her car, her mind was already formulating her next move. She needed to call Elijah to warn him. They would need to act fast to stay ahead of the investigation that was sure to follow. And Isaiah. She would have to deal with him too, now that he was awake and remembered everything. As Zora drove away from Piedmont Park, the first light of dawn was breaking on the horizon. It was a new day, but for Zora Jackson, it marked the beginning of a descent into a darkness from which she might never return. Little did she know, her actions that night had set in motion a chain of events that would not only destroy her life, but would send shockwaves through the entire community. The web of lies, betrayal, and now murder was about to ensnare everyone in its deadly grasp. The following days passed in a blur of frantic activity and mounting tension. Zora felt as if she were walking a tightrope, each step potentially her last before plummeting into the abyss that awaited her. Isaiah's awakening had thrown their carefully constructed plan into chaos. Though still weak, he had begun to speak to the police, his fragmented memories slowly coalescing into a damning narrative. Zora had managed to limit her interactions with him, citing emotional distress, but she knew it was only a matter of time before she would have to face him and the truth. Elijah, upon learning of Nia's fate, had become a shell of himself. The weight of their actions seemed to physically crush him, and Zora found herself constantly having to bolster his resolve, to remind him of what was at stake if they faltered now. But it was Detective Carter who posed the most immediate threat. The seasoned investigator seemed to be everywhere at once, her probing questions and piercing gaze stripping away Zora's defenses layer by layer. It was during one such interrogation in a stark room at the police station that Zora felt her grip on the situation truly begin to slip. "Mrs. Jackson," Carter began, her tone deceptively casual, "can you explain to me why your cell phone pinged near Piedmont Park on the night your sister disappeared?" Zora's heart raced, but her face remained impassive. "I often drive through that area on my way home from the hospital. It helps me clear my head." Carter nodded, making a note. "And I suppose it's just a coincidence that your sister's phone last pinged in the exact same location?" For a moment, Zora faltered. I don't know anything about that. Nia and I weren't exactly on speaking terms, as you know." "Indeed," Carter mused, her eyes never leaving Zora's face. "It's interesting, though. We found some security camera footage from a convenience store near the park. It shows a woman matching your description purchasing a burner phone just hours before Nia disappeared. Care to explain that?" Zora felt the walls closing in. Her mind raced, searching for a plausible explanation, but coming up empty. "I think I'd like to speak to my lawyer now," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter leaned back, a glint of triumph in her eyes. "Of course, Mrs. Jackson. We'll continue this conversation later. Oh, and one more thing. We'll need you to come in for a DNA test. It's just a formality, you understand." As Zora left the police station, her legs felt like lead. She knew the net was tightening, that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. She needed to act, and fast. Her first stop was the hospital. She had to see Isaiah, to try and gauge how much he truly remembered, and perhaps to finish what she had started that fateful night. But as she approached his room, she was met with an unexpected sight. Elijah was there, sitting by Isaiah's bedside, deep in conversation. The brothers looked up as she entered, and the expression on Isaiah's face made her blood run cold. "Zora," Isaiah said, his voice weak but filled with a mixture of fear and disgust. "Elijah's told me everything. How could you?" For a moment, Zora stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Then, as the full impact of Elijah's betrayal hit her, Something inside her snapped. With a cry of rage, she lunged forward, her hands reaching for Isaiah's throat. But Elijah was faster, intercepting her and pinning her arms to her sides. "It's over, Zora," he said, his voice filled with regret and determination. "We can't keep living like this. It's time to face what we've done." As if on cue, the door burst open, and Detective Carter strode in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. "Zora Jackson," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "You're under arrest for the attempted murder of Isaiah Jackson and the murder of Nia Thompson." As the officers handcuffed her, Zora's mind reeled. How had it all fallen apart so quickly? She looked from Isaiah to Elijah, seeing in their eyes the final betrayal that had sealed her fate. As she was led away, Zora caught a glimpse of her reflection in a window. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, wild-eyed, disheveled, a far cry from the poised and successful realtor she had once been. In that moment, Zora realized the true cost of her actions. She had lost everything: her husband, her sister, her freedom, and ultimately herself. The web of lies and betrayal she had woven had become her own undoing, trapping her in a nightmare of her own making. As the police car pulled away from the hospital, carrying Zora towards an uncertain future, the sun was setting on Atlanta. It was the end of an era, the final chapter in a story of love, betrayal, and the darkest aspects of human nature. But for those left behind, Isaiah, struggling to come to terms with the betrayal of both his wife and his brother. Elijah, grappling with the weight of his own complicity, and the community at large, shaken by the tragic events that had unfolded in their midst. The repercussions of Zora's actions would continue to ripple outward, a stark reminder of how quickly a life built on lies can crumble. In the end, the truth had come to light, but at a cost higher than anyone could have imagined. The web of betrayal had ensnared them all, leaving behind a legacy of pain, regret, and shattered lives. 1 year later, the courtroom was packed as Judge Evelyn Hargrove prepared to deliver her sentence. The trial of Zora Jackson had captivated the nation, a sordid tale of love, betrayal, and murder that had played out in the headlines for months. Zora sat at the defendant's table, a shadow of her former self. Gone was the confident, successful realtor who had once commanded respect in Atlanta's high society. In her place was a woman hollowed out by guilt and regret, her once impeccable appearance now haggard and unkempt. As the judge began to speak, a hush fell over the courtroom. "Zora Jackson, you have been found guilty of the attempted murder of Isaiah Jackson and the second-degree murder of Nia Thompson. The crimes you have committed are heinous, born of jealousy, rage, and a callous disregard for human life." Zora's gaze remained fixed on the floor, unable to meet the eyes of those she had wronged. "However," the judge continued, "this court also recognizes the circumstances that led to these tragic events. The betrayal you suffered at the hands of your husband and sister, while not an excuse for your actions, provides context for the emotional state that drove you to commit these crimes." There was a murmur in the courtroom, quickly silenced by the bang of the judge's gavel. "Taking all factors into consideration, this court sentences you to 25 years in prison for the murder of Nia Thompson and 15 years for the attempted murder of Isaiah Jackson, to be served concurrently. You will be eligible for parole after serving a minimum of 20 years. As the sentence was read, Zora finally looked up, her eyes scanning the courtroom. She saw Isaiah, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, relief, sadness, and perhaps a flicker of the love they had once shared. Beside him sat Elijah, his head bowed, the weight of his own role in the tragedy evident in the slump of his shoulders. As Zora was led away, her gaze lingered on the empty seat where Nia should have been. The sister she had lost, first to betrayal and then to her own unforgiving hands. In that moment, the full impact of her actions hit her anew, and she felt a pain so deep it took her breath away. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements from those involved. Isaiah, leaning heavily on a cane, a lasting reminder of his near-fatal accident, faced the cameras with quiet dignity. "Today, justice has been served," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "But there are no winners here. We have all lost something: family, trust, our sense of security. My hope now is that we can begin to heal, to move forward from this tragedy and find a way to forgive, not just Zora, but ourselves." Elijah, standing slightly apart from his brother, declined to comment, his haunted expression speaking volumes about the guilt he still carried. As news of the sentencing spread, the community that had been rocked by the Jackson family tragedy began the slow process of moving on. The story of Zora Jackson became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly a life built on success and respectability could unravel when the foundations of trust and loyalty were betrayed. In the years that followed, those touched by the tragedy would struggle to rebuild their lives. Isaiah, after months of physical therapy, returned to his work in biology, throwing himself into research with renewed vigor. Elijah, unable to shake the guilt of his role in the events, left Atlanta, seeking redemption in humanitarian work abroad. And Zora, behind the cold walls of prison, was left to contemplate the choices that had led her to this point. In the quiet of her cell, she began to write, pouring out her story as a form of catharsis and warning to others who might find themselves on the brink of making similarly devastating choices. As for the community of Atlanta, life gradually returned to normal. But on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the trees of Piedmont Park, some swore they could still hear the echoes of that fateful confrontation, a stark reminder of the destructive power of betrayal and the high cost of revenge. The tale of Zora Jackson and the web of betrayal she had woven would live on, a modern tragedy that served as a sobering reminder of the fragility of trust, the destructive power of jealousy, and the devastating consequences that can arise when love turns to hatred. In the end, it was a story with no true victors, only survivors left to pick up the pieces of shattered lives and broken dreams. But perhaps, in the telling and retelling of this cautionary tale, others might learn from the mistakes of those involved, choosing forgiveness over vengeance, honesty over deception, and love over hate. For in the wake of such a tragedy, it is often in the lessons learned and the wisdom gained that some small measure of redemption can be found. And so the story of Zora Jackson, Isaiah, Elijah, and Mia would live on, a stark reminder of the power of choices and the enduring human capacity for both great love and terrible destruction.